How's it going, YouTube? Coming in today with another video, and today, guys, what the bring to you is going to be the new ruling video, and I do hope that you enjoy today's video because it's going to be very important moving forward that you know these rulings. These are going to be from very basic to very complex, and I really want to make sure that you know these because this is going to be the main way that you're able to actually really win games. I don't care what the ruling is that you need to know. If you know the ruling in the moment, you win the game, most times. Because it's the same thing with, like, location. And I know I keep getting questions and questions about location. Location is very complex, and that's something where you kind of just have to understand that that's how that works. But, again, just to clarify real fast, if you have Ash Blossom and you use Ash Blossom, you send it from your hand to grave for cost, and then it gets crowed out of the graveyard, no, that won't stop the activation of Ash. But, if you have a card that is moved to a different location, and it has an activation once we're on a new chain in that location, if it's moved from the location that it was sent to, it no longer has a window to activate. And that is just how it works. It's like if Seals is tributed, put in grave, now it's crowed out of the graveyard. It's almost like it never went to the graveyard and it was never tributed because it doesn't realize that it was there. So now it's just in a new spot. Think about it like when a card is like compulsed back to deck or something when it's supposed to have an activation on a new chain. It's nowhere to be found, so it has no activation. It's very similar. I know that it's very complicated, but that's just how it's ruled. But let's get into the new rulings. If you haven't already checked out my sponsors over on RW, Cloud, Gem, Arla, Imperium, Dragonshield, or Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so all down below in the description. Also, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so we can hit 30,000 by the end of the year. I'm very excited to hit this goal. As always, I love you all. Thank you all for 23,000, and let's hop right into the first ruling. So the first one's going to be very relevant because we have the new Blue Eye Structure deck coming out. But Blue Eye Spirit Dragon is a card that we've seen for a long time. It's been out for a long time, but this was the Pendulum Killer because the first line of this card says neither player can special summon 2 or more monsters at the same time. The biggest question of the month right now, and shoutouts to my friends from the Judges Lounge for informing me that this was a big issue. This is one that I want to squash right away. If your opponent tells you that you cannot Nibiru under Spirit Dragon, Judge. You're calling Judge immediately, and you should know that that is just objectively incorrect. Reading is broken. So, Spirit Dragon says neither player can special summon 2 or more monsters at the same time. Now, if you know the previous ruling, you cannot Nibiru under Winda. And Winda says that you can only special summon once per turn. This is because Nibiru summons itself, then it summons a token. Gamma summons Gamma and Driver at the same time. So you can't Gamma under Spirit, you can Nibiru under Spirit because it summons Nibiru, then it summons a token. Conjunctions are very, very important in this game. If you ever see like an also, which we'll get into later, those types of things really do matter when it comes to different effects interacting with each other. Now, if you read through Haggard Lizardos, this card does allow you to banish a monster from the face-up field or grave with 2,000 or less attack, then target a face-up monster in the field and make its attack become equal to that monster. Very easy way to be able to clear something like a Nibiru token. If you leave it in attack, you can Haggard, make it very small, and then swing over it. So if you haven't thought about that, it's very good. But the other part about this is that if you banish a reptile, you can draw a card. So, the big question is, can you activate Haggard when you're already under Droll? The answer is yes, as long as you don't banish a reptile. Because if you banish something for cost, you're automatically saying, this is what I'm attempting to do, and there's no way possible that I can draw. It's very similar to, like, if you activate talent, you kind of just say which effect you're doing, so you can't ash the whole card, right? Because if you're taking a monster, you're clarifying that you're taking and you're not drawing. Banishing a non-reptile works very much so the same way. So this is important because it's very different if you are working with something that is also a mandatory draw. So if you banish a reptile, you're going into the territory that would be a mandatory draw. If you look at Blackbeard, the Planet Patrol Link 2, that card is a mandatory draw, so you cannot attempt to use that effect under Droll. Now, you can chain it to Droll, And that's something where if you use it and your opponent chains draw on a new chain link or something, right, you still are allowed to use the Blackbeard effect, you just won't draw. But if you're already under a draw effect, you cannot use it because it is a mandatory draw, which means that the whole effect cannot be activated. Now, there's like 100 questions as far as how Cryptor works, and this is going to be something too that I want to make sure that I just go over and I break it down because you're going to be seeing this deck a lot. Now, the attack gain is not permanent, and it's not something that's just glued to the card. If you Imperium Cryptor, it will go back down to 25. Now, if there's like a Dormouse effect in action, then of course you'll gain like the 600. But it is not a permanent gain to the card. If the card becomes negated, the attack boost will leave the card from being banished and brought back to the board. If you summon a monster to a Cryptor arrow, although it may already be negated, the monster will be able to use its effect because Cryptor's line of text just says that if it's pointing to something, that it can't be negated. So at that point, it'll make the card live again. But what's really interesting is that let's say that you have a effect that can pull the monster away from the arrow that the Cryptor is pointing to. You have like a Widow Anchor, right? Your opponent goes, I'm going to go ahead and activate my Cryptor. There's a monster pointing to it. I know this is negated, but I have a monster pointing to it, so it's not going to be negated. If you then take away the monster to make sure that there's no monsters pointing to the Cryptor will be negated again because it is no longer applying the effect that says it can't be negated because there's no longer a monster. So that's a really unique interaction that you should know. The other thing about attack gains, let's say that you have a monster like Heart's Cryptor that is at 56 because it's already been banished, brought back, and it has the Dormouse boost. Now, if you activate something like Droplet, the Droplet will have the card and then negate the card. So this is very similar back when we had Apollousa. Let's say that Apollousa was at 3,200 because it came out with 4 counters. And then you go ahead and Droplet in Apollousa. It will be 1,600 attack, and then it will be negated. But it'll keep the 1,600 because it halves first, and then negates. So it'll be very similar to Cryptor, where if it's at 56, and then you Droplet the card, it'll have first, and then negate the card. So it'll still keep half the attack of 56, but it will not go back down to its base stat. The next ruling that you should know is going to be any kind of Book of Moon effect versus Duo Drive. If your opponent goes ahead and uses the effect of Duo Drive to detach, and then you chain Valor or Imperm, and your opponent chains something like Book of Eclipse, the Duo Drive will get flipped face down, and it can detach from the face down Duo Drive, which is pretty crazy. That is something that you really want to know. They are still considered Xyz materials, even if the monster is face down. If a monster does get booked face down, it will still see that it has materials, which is very funny. It's very similar if you activate Magical Hats, and this will never come up, but if you activate Magical Hats on a Xyz monster, and the monster gets shuffled around with a bunch of other cards, you will know which one's the Xyz monster, because you will still see the materials, which is very funny. But this is something that does happen. It doesn't happen very often as we don't really see the books anymore, which I'm surprised because I'm sure we'll see them again soon. But this is something else that you are allowed to do. Alright, so we're going to be doing a little bit of reading here. This is very important. So, Ash Blossom versus Red Eyes Fusion and Ash Blossom versus Pot of Prosperity. How does it resolve? So, the number one thing that you gotta know is how something is worded. So the last part of Red Eyes Fusion says that you cannot normal or special summon other monsters the turn you activate this card. The last line of Pot of Prosperity says you cannot draw cards by effects the turn you activate this card. Now, if you Ash either of these cards, you'll notice on both of them it says the turn you activate this card. Ash negates effect, not activation. If you had Judgment, this is a different story. You negate the activation, the card was never activated. So if you Ash these cards, both of those restrictions will still apply. You still can't draw cards from card effects, and you still can't summon. But on Pot of Prosperity, this card says for the rest of the turn after this card resolves, any damage your opponent takes is halved. If you Ash Pot of Prosperity, this effect no longer applies because it's not after a period. It is still a part of the same effect, and it's also joined by the also, which allows you to excavate cards. So if you Ash Pot of Prosperity, you will still take full damage, but your opponent still cannot add cards to their hand by drawing. Another very similar situation that I want to make sure that you're aware of so nobody gets hit by this. This is very, very important and low-key kind of comes up quite often. So, if you activate a Bestial and your opponent chains Bell, this is fine. The Bestial will just stay in your hand. The activation of the card is negated. And that's what's really good about Bell in situations against Striker. Let's say you run over a Striker Link, they use Ray Effect. In the damage step, you can Bell because the card negates activation. But let's say that this was in the main phase. You activate a Bestial, your opponent chains Bell, then your opponent slams talent because you used a card effect. That's not legal. You cannot do that. Talent reads, if your opponent has activated a monster effect, you technically didn't because the Bell negated the activation of the Bestial. So this is something where you really want to make sure that you're always paying attention because you technically didn't activate anything because the Bell stopped it, so your opponent cannot hit you with talent. It's the same thing if your opponent hits you with, like, Solemn Strike. Technically, it was never activated because the activation was negated. So this is another one where I feel like more often than not, the general player base just does not understand how this works, and I want to make sure that this is crystal clear because this is, like, one of the craziest interactions in the game. So, Scareclaw Kashtira has a very unique effect, and we've seen it before, but it's still something that we don't see very often. So, cards like Chaos Angel say that it's unaffected by your opponent's activated monster effects. Things like Scareclaw Kashtira's effect is just not an activated effect, it just happens. So, this comes up quite often. Let's say that you have a Scareclaw Kashtira on a board, and you also have a Kashtira Fenrir. Your opponent has a Mirror Jade on the board that they haven't used yet. Let's say that you go battle phase, and your opponent goes, that's fine, and you go Fenrir, declare an attack into the Mirror Jade. What's crazy is that you can just go Fenrir Chainlink 1, target Mirror Jade, they go Chain Mirror Jade, and you go, that's fine, your Mirror Jade's negated. Like, you can still send for cost, but as soon as you declare an attack on something, it's already negated, as long as you declared with a Kashtira or a Scareclaw monster, which is actually so broken, and it comes up so often. So if you see your opponent trying to go to battle phase, there's a reason why they want to go to battle phase, right? Like, they have Scareclaw Kashtira, and that's just the out, right? So it's pretty crazy. This is the card that can outright just out Baguska, because Baguska just negates the activated effects of monsters as well. And again, this is not an activated effect, it just happens. So as soon as your opponent says it's okay to enter battle phase, and there's like nothing start step, there's no quick effects, and then you just declare an attack with any Kashtira, whatever you're attacking into is auto-negated. It doesn't activate, nothing happens, it just is auto-negated. So even if it's like a Chaos Angel that just says it's unaffected, it is now negated, and you can banish it face down. This also applies if your opponent had like an 8-mat Noir. I hope that you enjoyed today's video and learned something. Of course, I'm always trying to make sure that you are all prepared as possible for your events, and I really do hope that any of these rulings come up for you and it helps you win a match. It's really exciting when a ruling comes up and you just know the ruling because you're like, oh, this play is going to be sick, and your opponent has no idea what's coming. I just want to see you all do well and prosper, and I love that you're all on this journey with me. We're going to keep growing the channel. It's going to be a great time, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you all so much. Subscribe to the channel.